Hi, this is Alexander Scott, a member of LANS, presenting this week's edition of our updates. Before we begin, a reminder to please visit our website at jalans.org to view more party material, or follow us on social media. Our Twitter handle is @lans_JA. First, we will begin with an article from RJR titled Private Security Firms to Provide Close Protection Services to Some Public Officials. And in this article, the National Security Minister, Dr. Horace Chang, announced that private security companies will be used to provide security to public officials. And this comes as members of the Protective Services Division are expected to be transferred to other areas of the JCF to help in the fight against crime. Dr. Chang, when speaking at Parliament, noted that there are 515 officers who were assigned to the division in 2020, and that some 300 were actually assigned to public officials. He further stated that the current system as it is untenable, and that these officers should be focusing on dealing with crime as opposed to protecting politicians, when in the grand scheme of things in Jamaican society, politicians, they face a very low likelihood of being affected by crime. So the thinking is, instead of having these police officers protecting these politicians who will be unlikely to face actual criminal issues, they should be focused more on fighting crime. And that kind of makes sense. Now, as a result, he says he's going to be outsourcing some of the protection services to private firms. However, some public officials will still have police officers protecting. Now, this is not a good move. It is true that the Protective Services Division is bloated and that the officers could, in reality, be better used in other areas. And it's even true that with crime against politicians being next to non-existent, we could move these officers and risk very little in politicians being harmed, and actually see the results of lowering crime. However, the actual outsourcing of police matters to the private sector is a move we should all be worried about. First of all, it will cost the state a lot to pay these private security officers. And if they currently have the inability to pay the Jamaica Constabulary Force a decent wage, how then are they going to pay for the, quote, top quality trained, end quote, security that they're going to be getting to protect public officials? Now, it is no secret that high-end security officials get paid a lot more than any police officer. So again, how is the government going to pay for this proposed idea? More worrying, though, is the state slowly ceding more authority and more of its matters to the private sector, especially as it relates to running the nation's critical areas. As an example, we saw this with JPS, which in truth was an albatross around the neck of the government of Jamaica. Now, after the sale, we've seen people hampered with very high energy costs, we've been left with an outdated grid, and we have an inability to change anything because it is, and I quote, in private hands, end quote. We can't do anything about it as a people. This move could be the thin edge of the wedge which sees the wholesale introduction of private security officers doing policing. And this is going to be a very gray area when it comes to accountability. Something which is bad for the people. We already face a serious accountability deficit when it comes to security officials. But this is going to be an excellent boon for any government seeking to crush dissent or ram through unpopular legislation. This administration, which has openly stated its intention to privatize whatever it can, as we are seeing with the many attempts to privatize the NWC, must be condemned. We oppose the wholesale privatization of our critical sectors, and we condemn the slow-rolling attempt to bring in private security firms who are accountable to no one in order to do policing. Next, we move to foreign affairs. Wednesday, the 6th of October, marked the 45th anniversary of the terrorist bombing of the Cubana Aviation Flight 455 over Barbados. The act, which resulted in the loss of 73 lives, affected, as noted in the article carried by the Barbados Advocate, not only Cuba, but also Barbados, Guyana, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The event was remembered in Barbados for a gathering of Cuban medical personnel working in the island, the Cuban and Venezuelan ambassadors to Barbados, and members of the Barbadian Friendship Association gathered in commemoration. At the event, it was noted that some of the perpetrators of the terrorist act, have avoided prosecution with the help of the United States, but that they, Cuba, were still pursuing justice for the matter. Now, we at Lands mourn with our neighbors. The bombing of the flight was a dastardly act of terrorism and is one of many which were and still are directed at nations such as Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Bolivia. This act, as awful as it is, remains the standard operating practice for the United States and its imperial allies, especially when they come upon a nation which is not willing to play ball. There are countless examples of leaders in Latin America, for example, who have been either ousted or straight up murdered for simply having the temerity to go against Washington's dictate. And the blowing up of this plane is not something that the US is currently above when it comes to maintaining its position in the region. This is not something from the distant past. This is an ongoing thing. We saw this in action in Bolivia, where racist mobs and the military forced Evo Morales, the former president, out of office after MAS, the movement towards socialism, won the election. We have, with our own eyes, seen the lynching of suspected PSUV members, and they were suspected simply because they were black. This took place in Venezuela during the coup attempt with the Guarimbas, and we also saw the public gratuitous displays of violence in Nicaragua the following year as the US-backed forces tried to oust the Sandinista government. We mourn with our comrades, and we mark this dark day in our collective histories, both as a region and as organizations seeking to empower and liberate the worker. But we must also remain on guard because, as noted earlier, these actions continue to this day. We saw an attempt only a few months ago in Cuba to overthrow the government, an act of terrorism. We are seeing a build-up of this kind in Nicaragua again as they are heading towards elections. We must be on guard to thwart any such attempts to overthrow these revolutionary governments and to stymie these movements. But we must also do what the Cubans and the Bolivians are doing and seek justice for the victims and hold the perpetrators to account. We must defend the revolution, and we must hold to account those who seek to undermine it. That must be a priority for left-wing movements if we are to both hold on to power in this region and positively impact our people. Finally, we end with looking at the nation's continued COVID vaccine rollouts. In an article in RJR titled Health Ministry's Vaccination Figures Confusing, says MP Juliet Holness, Juliet Holness blasted the health officials for the way in which they are currently reporting figures for persons who are vaccinated against COVID-19. This came during a recent sitting of Parliament, when a health official cited figures stating that some 81,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine have been administered to children. And when pressed by Mrs. Holness, it was revealed that of those administered, only 34,193 are fully vaccinated, got both doses, and that some 12,614 have only had a single dose of the vaccine. She, that is Mrs. Holness, also noted that the way in which the numbers are presented causes both confusion as one tries to parse out the facts in the figures and basically find out what the figures mean, but it also gives a false impression of the nation's achievements by lumping fully vaccinated persons with partially vaccinated individuals. Lumping them all into the same set of figures gives a false impression of success when really it both confuses and is a sign of a bad program. Separately, in an article from Nationwide News titled Vaccine Program Rift, Cabinet and Health Ministry Standoff Over Mandatory Vaccination Policy, it was reported that the Prime Minister is increasingly pressuring the Ministry of Health to lay out its position on mandatory vaccinations in Jamaica, and if it is okay, that is mandatory vaccinations, what form should they take? It was further reported that the Ministry of Health has so far resisted attempts to state a position on the matter, citing a World Health Organization guideline as its defense. Now, we agree with Mrs. Holness. The way that the numbers have been presented, that is, the numbers of persons vaccinated, has been presented is both confusing and presents a false picture. This in no way helps us as we aim to have as many people vaccinated as possible. The false picture painted could very well lead to persons saying, hey, there is no need for me to be vaccinated because I'm seeing a whole bag of people are being vaccinated according to the numbers. And in the end, we would find ourselves back in this situation we are currently in, where we are struggling to deal with hospital admissions. The numbers must be presented in a clear, easy to understand fashion which is accessible to all, and quite frankly, that would go a long way in helping our public education campaign as it relates to COVID. Also, the fact that the government still has not come out with a position, or at the very least sought a legal opinion from legal scholars on this matter, shows us in no uncertain terms that they have seriously dropped the ball when it comes to COVID management. This, that is mandatory vaccinations, was always going to be a conversation we needed to have. We're seeing industry pushing for mandatory vaccination, and large swaths of the workers are, quite frankly, against it. The government must come out with a position on the matter and make it public so that there can be no ambiguity on the matter. Barbados has sought legal opinions, as have many other CARICOM nations, and we must follow suit. Seeking an opinion does not mean implementing it, and even if it is implemented, at least the parties which feel aggrieved can challenge it, as is being done in Antigua. But the government must take a public position on this matter. Make it clear, and do not hide behind the shield of the World Health Organization. Honesty and clarity are the only ways in which we will win the people over to being willingly vaccinated, and that is what needs to be done if we are to handle this pandemic, which is fast overtaking us. Once again, this is Alexander Scott, and you've been listening to LAND's Weekly Updates.